Okay, the next PowerPoint focuses on child abuse. We'll talk about how child abuse is defined. So I mentioned that I would be discussing policy as much as I could within every PowerPoint lecture so you guys are familiar with it. And the Keeping Children and Families Safe Act of 2003 is an example of a policy, and it defines child abuse as any act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Reports of child abuse, more than half of alleged child abuse or neglect, were made by professionals. So one of the reasons that this is a really important topic for FCS professionals, because many of you will be working directly with children and may be the only person that the children have to advocate for them. And so teachers, lawyers, police officers, and social services staff make up the bulk of the people that end up reporting child abuse or neglect. The rest are made by non-professionals, which can include friends, neighbors, sports coaches, and relatives. And so, of course, having interaction with children in other ways is a huge responsibility as well, and everyone should feel obligated to report any abuse because children are a vulnerable population that can't report for themselves. When it comes to the characteristics of victims of child abuse, children in the age group from birth to 1 year have the highest rate of victimization, so they face the greatest risk. This is alternately true with seniors as well. The elderly, the very old elderly group, are the ones that face the highest rate of victimization. And so the more vulnerable, the less powerful, the more helpless, the greater the likelihood of being victimized. It's about equally distributed between the sexes, and as far as race, ethnicity, Caucasians make up about half of child abuse cases, 23% are made up by African American children, 18.4% are made up by Hispanic children, and the rest include a mixture of ethnicities. When it comes to the types of child abuse, neglect is the most common. Neglect includes not taking care of a child properly, not making sure they have adequate food, shelter, clothing, etc., not caring for them, not disciplining them, not knowing where they are. Neglect is just what it sounds like. It's neglect, and it is the most common type of child abuse, probably because it's the easiest to detect. People can oftentimes see signs of neglect and will report children they think are being neglected. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse are difficult to detect. Oftentimes you have to have interaction with the family or some type of evidence. If there are unexplained bruises or body parts being hurt or bones being broken, then sometimes there'll be an investigation launched. Sexual abuse is more difficult to detect, but I have a video that you guys will be required to watch that goes over some of the signs that children can exhibit. And then emotional abuse, of course, is very difficult to detect and prosecute, but virtually any physical abuse that you find going on will always be accompanied by emotional or verbal abuse. And emotional abuse can include making a child feel bad, making a child feel crazy, calling them names, not speaking to them, punishing them by not speaking, withdrawing, and basically just not responding appropriately when it comes to emotions. Medical neglect is one probably you see in the news sometimes, when parents refuse to get treatment for a child when they've been diagnosed with a serious illness. And we are required by law to protect children and take care of them. Sometimes a parent's religion interferes with the type of medical advice they're given. This is sometimes a problem and prosecuted. It depends on the case. But it is a form of child abuse if there is a treatment that is expected to work, be effective, and the parents are refusing it because the child is a vulnerable human being and doesn't have a lot of choice. More than 5 children die every day as a result of child abuse. This statistic is probably grossly underestimated. It's difficult to detect child abuse. It's difficult to prosecute. The way that the law is set up protects parents a great deal. And so when child abuse cases are investigated, oftentimes parents have a heads up about it. They know it's coming. It's difficult to, you don't typically find or see a parent abusing a child. You have to go determine based on signs or evidence of abuse that have occurred after the fact. 80% of the children that end up dying are under the age of 4, and almost half of the deaths that are reported are caused by neglect. When it comes to perpetration, most are parents, about 80% are parents, and most of those are biological parents. There is a misconception that it's mostly step parents or foster parents doing the abusing. It's actually mostly biological parents doing the abusing. And this has a lot to do with the cycle or generational transmission of abuse. When children experience abuse themselves, or they've grown up in an abusive environment, they're more likely to abuse their own children, particularly if they're not educated about child abuse. Most of the perpetrators are women, and most are younger than 40. The reason most are women is because women do the bulk of the caregiving and have more interactions with children than men typically do. Something to think about, and this is actually one of the questions that I like to pose in class and have us engage in discussion about, and it was one of your midterm questions. 14% of men in prison and 36% of women in prison report that they were abused as children. Children who experience child abuse are 9 times more likely to engage in criminal activity compared to children that are not abused. And as many as 2/3 of the people in treatment for drug abuse report being abused or neglected as children. And so what I like to have students think about is the outcome of child abuse, how that affects society, how it affects drug abuse, drug use, and placing people in the criminal justice system, all very expensive. When really, if we had a more preventative focus where we tried to prevent child abuse in a harsher or more effective manner, then perhaps we wouldn't have as many people engaging in criminal activity, being imprisoned, or abusing substances as a way to cope. And so it is difficult to prevent child abuse, but one of the most slippery slopes when it comes to abuse is spanking and how spanking is used. And parents are overwhelmingly in the United States are for spanking and believe that it is a harmless way to discipline children. But the research doesn't support that statement. In fact, children that are spanked are always more likely, in every study that's ever been conducted, to engage in criminal activity or to abuse substances or to be aggressive themselves or even abuse their own children. This suggests that maybe it's not actually spanking going on. It could be that parents, the way they perceive spanking is very different across parents and families. We refer to this as harsh discipline when it is abuse or borders on abuse. Many people use spanking when they're angry and they don't talk to the children about what they're being punished about or try to teach them a lesson. They just use punitive corporal punishment. And so it's just something to think about. You have your own ideas and your own opinions about spanking, I know, and it is a very controversial topic. But if you look at the research, you read what it says, you'll find that what I'm telling you is true. One of my biggest pet peeves concerns parental violence in children, and so I have lots of experience working in battered women's shelters and on hotlines and sitting on the board of directors for the local domestic violence agency. One of the things that we hear a lot as crisis intervention workers, particularly on the hotline, when somebody calls and reports abuse by their partner, typically women, they will say, well, he never touches the child, or he doesn't abuse my child, but he is abusing me, so he's not an abusive parent. And I like to point out that even when kids are exposed to parental violence, so that means they're not being abused directly, but they're witnessing their parental violence or caregiver violence, they have negative outcomes. So there's an increased risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, impaired social competence, substance abuse, suicide, anxiety, depression, behavior problems, and most notably sleep deprivation. There's a lot of research regarding sleep deprivation and how that affects other areas of children's lives. And so there is a great deal of support in the literature regarding the exposure to parental violence and how it is extremely negative for children. So they don't have to be on the receiving end of abuse, just witnessing it is bad enough. So children deserve to have a parent or parents or parental figures that believe in them and their abilities. They deserve to live in a safe and healthy environment, and it's up to us as adults to make sure that they do live in a safe and healthy environment, to live in a home free from abuse of any kind, doesn't matter what type, to have access to and support of a high-quality education, to be taught skills that'll help them succeed and become good citizens, and to know that they're loved and wanted always. And I point this out because it's important to realize that even though you may not have children or you may not work with children directly, almost all of us interact with other people's children, and you may be the adult that teaches someone that they're loved and wanted, and helps them and protects them and is that role model that they need in their life. So remember, children are always watching and paying attention. What can FCS professionals do? We can identify the risk and protective factors, which is what we do. We focus on lowering risk and increasing protective factors like having high self-esteem, being from a loving home. It can protect people from potential negative outcomes. We can strengthen families and communities through programs and supportive initiatives. Sorry if that made a loud noise, I moved. We can advocate for all families, we can educate other people, and we can refuse to tolerate abuse in any shape or form. So we report any suspicions of abuse and realize that sometimes we're the only voice that children have. We're protected, we're actually mandated by law to report any suspected abuse, and we are protected by the law if we make a good faith report, meaning we're not just making stuff up and accusing anyone of abuse.